Your Excellency Dr. Shawqy Ibrahim Allam, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, I offer you Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to ask you a question about democracy. You are, sir, the first democratically elected Grand Mufti of Egypt. So are all the MEPs who are gathered in this room. Some sections of Islamic society decry and say that democracy doesn't play a part in Islam. They offer other solutions like Khilafat, etc. I'd like to hear your opinion on democracy. Secondly, what is it that your role is going to be during your tenure as the Grand Mufti of Egypt? What legacy would you like to leave the world? And thirdly, I would like to welcome you as a voice of moderation to a conference that I propose holding both in London and in the European community, that you could address the youth of this world that is being radicalized, and your moderate voice would be most welcome, and I'd like to invite you to be the main speaker at these conferences. Thank you.
Your Excellency, would you like to respond?
أنا بداية أشكركم كثيرا على هذه الأسئلة التي تدل على حرص.
Well, thank you all for your questions. I think that shows the questions reflect your concerns in learning about Egypt and the position of the Mufti on these subjects. I mean, these issues do raise many questions. Most of the questions raised seemed to relate to the death sentences on the penalty itself, but there are also issues raised with regard to women, to dialogue, and the issue of security with regard to the Islamic State. Now, when it comes to capital punishment and the role of the Mufti, well, the Egyptian Criminal Code has several procedures that protect the interests of the accused. You may well be surprised to hear that. But given the scope of these procedures, it is very, very difficult for for death sentences to actually be carried out. Let me explain a little bit how these procedures work. Well, the police generally carry out the initial investigation, and then the judiciary then make the accusations, and then it is up to the judges to decide. Since 1959, we've also had an investigating judge. So it's the judiciary which deals with the investigation and the case, and in certain cases, if necessary, the second part of the investigation is carried out by the judges. And there are 3 of these judges, magistrates, and if they believe that the death sentence is warranted, well, prior to issuing their judgment, they have to, according to the procedural code, send the entire file to the Grand Mufti. So we receive the entire file. We receive all the information regarding the accusation, the investigation, and the suggested death penalty. The Mufti studies all the documentation received and then provides a legal opinion. that doesn't relate to the form or the substance. At any stage of the trial, he just gives a legal opinion and on whether this is in line with Islamic law or not. So we don't say yes or no to the death penalty if there is no strong conviction. With regard to conviction, we act only on the basis of the documents that we've received. We then draw up a report, and our opinion is then sent to the judge who is responsible for the case. Once the opinion reaches that judge, it is up to the judge to decide. He takes account of our opinion, but it is only an advisory opinion. He can base himself on our opinion, or he can completely ignore it. So it's up to the judge responsible for the case who takes the final decision. So basically, it depends on the judge whether the death sentence is decreed or not, and he can base himself on the Mufti's opinion or otherwise. If a death sentence is decreed, then there is a possibility for the accused to appeal. In addition, the defendants can appeal to the Supreme Court, which is the Court of Appeal. Around 99% of these judgments are then annulled, and then there's a new trial that takes place. So following the appeal, then there's a new case, and if the new body that's dealing with the case believes that the death sentence is the appropriate penalty, they then once again have to send the entire file to the Mufti. We once again study the situation, we look at all the documents, we draw up a second legal opinion, and then we send that back to the judge, and if the judge once again decrees a death penalty, that then has to be ratified by the President of the Republic. So if you look at this statistically, it takes about 4 years to go through all these procedures on average. And that's to be sure that the death penalty is necessary, and also for it to be implemented. Statistically speaking, very, very few cases are actually end up being carried out. When it comes to cases carried out in absence, when the person is subsequently arrested, the entire procedure has to be gone through right from the start, even if the sentence has already been handed down. Now, why do we believe that capital punishment is essential for us as a possibility? Well, this is something that we have to look at very carefully. Basically, this is because of the terror that has been caused by the perpetrator when committing the crime. I mean, it is true that mercy could be raised as a criterion, but when you look back to the crime when it was actually committed, you have to think about the victim. I mean, the perpetrator has killed another person, an individual who had a right to live. It's someone who perhaps had a family, was married, had children, and had the right to continue to live. When you look at all these circumstances, the entire situation and the life that has been prematurely ended, well then you can understand the need for us to maintain capital punishment. There are many European and Arab philosophers who have written essays on crimes and punishments, and Islam believes that the dissuasive nature of capital punishment remains essential. Essentially, it's an eye for an eye when someone has killed someone else. So that's as far as capital punishment, with regard to capital punishment. Now, in addition, Egypt is currently going through, well, quite honestly, quite a good period. We've held 2 constitutional referenda now, and they've shown how we want to move forward. The people took a decision on the 2014 constitution. I was involved in drawing that up. I was part of the appropriately named group of 50, and the referendum result was very positive for us and confirmed the will of the people. The second electoral date, as it were, was the presidential election. And let me take this opportunity to talk about the situation of Copts in Egypt now. Now, quite honestly, whatever a person's religion, in Egypt, a person is first and foremost an Egyptian. We barely hear the use of the term minority in Egypt. As you know, Egypt was built by Egyptian society as a whole. Egyptian society can integrate all cultures. Those people who know about Egyptian history know that Egyptian history requires everyone and has included everyone. I can't build history by myself. It takes everyone to do that together. In Egypt, we live together. It's an almost ideal situation in that we live together. Different groups are together at school, at university, in our neighbourhoods, everywhere. No one knows who is Muslim and who is Christian, for example, at school or whatever. Even at work, there is no difference made between Christians and Muslims. So I can reassure you with regard to the situation of Copts in Egypt. There should be no concern over them. They're stakeholders in Egypt's future. And as I said earlier, I'm a fervent believer in the rule of law, and that is the principle that should underpin all nations, not only Egypt, but everywhere. The law is valid for everyone with no distinction between individuals.
كما هو الإسلام أريد أن أؤكد على ذلك.
Now, when it comes to the situation of women in Egypt, well, I have published some detailed research on women's situation in Islam and also on political rights of women and also women's rights in marriage. Women benefit from full rights as citizens and as the partners of men. There was a speech of the Prophet in which he mentions women as men's partners. The Quran isn't addressed to men and women separately, unless that's only the case in certain areas where it's necessary to take account of the specific nature of men and women. For example, when it comes to certain religious practices which women cannot be involved in during certain periods. There are certain times when women are not required to fast or to pray, for example. When it comes to Islam, women and men are equals. Now, another factor is that the Egyptian constitution of 2014 contains a very detailed article to ensure that there is no misinterpretation following the adoption of certain laws by Parliament which would damage the situation of women in terms of their rights. I can reassure you on that point, and I can say to you that women enjoy all rights. In fact, in a few years you may well find that it's men who are calling for their rights to be respected in certain cases. Now, when it comes to the Islamic State and its activities, and the activities of the so-called leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, well, I would rather not talk of a caliphate, and I would rather not speak of a state or an Islamic state, because the conditions necessary for a term such as that, terms such as those to be accepted, are utterly absent. I mean, if you look at the actions of the organisation known as Islamic State, if you look at them in the light of the precepts and ethics of Islam as a religion, you'll see that actually what their actions are criminal acts. The law needs to be applied, and the principle of the rule of law needs to be used to get these people into court. They need to be judged on the basis of how serious their acts are. There is no Islamic religious text that incites people to violence and destruction. There is nothing which justifies murder. In Islam, it states that humanity has been created from a man and a woman, and the most noble people are the most pious among us. God could have created just one community, just one religion, but God created diversity for a reason. The reason is known only by God. But the freedom of religion needs to be guaranteed, and is guaranteed. We drew up an article on this subject, and we held many exchanges on this, but we wrote that the freedom of religion needs to be guaranteed. Every human being has the right to believe in whichever religion they want to. Nevertheless, all actions need to take place in a framework that is underpinned by the law. I don't believe that any of the actions carried out by the Islamic State can be justified using Islam. These are people who use religion to justify their actions. But there is no single Islamic reference that justifies the eviction of people from their homes and the movement of people. Islamic texts state that during a war, for example, you can only fight against enemy fighters. Women are not fighters. Islam has said that it is illegal to kill women and children, and also people who are in religious buildings, for example, a priest, a rabbi, etc. It is banned to attack these people. It is also illegal to destroy a house or to cut down a tree. I can provide you with clear religious texts if you require them. If we take account of all of these texts as a whole, you can easily say that there is a morality of war in Islam. And we're not only talking about wars within countries such as Iraq, Syria or Egypt, for example. The actions of the so-called Islamic State can in no case be accepted and justified using Islamic texts. Now, when it comes to the wide-scale departure of Christians from Egypt, well, I don't think this can be described as a phenomenon. I mean, there is a certain amount of pressure, perhaps, but I've already said that there is perfect harmony in Egypt. And I can give you an example. Dr. Abil Noka, who is a Christian. Now, when you study history and when you look at the biography of this historical person, you can see that when he was a child, he went to an Islamic school in spite of the fact that he was a Christian. He was a Christian, but he wrote a work on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and it was called Muhammad, the Prophet and the Message. And in that work he highlighted the positive aspects of Islam. He was a Christian and remained a Christian until he died. Many leaders in the Islamic world were, for example, breastfed by Christian women. And I think that really is a symbol of the deep-rooted interaction between the faiths in Egypt. We respect human rights, and we believe that human rights are extremely important. And the proof of that is that an article in our 2014 constitution is is given over to human rights. This may well surprise you, but because I know that international conventions take account of national laws adopted by legislative powers. But we referred to the need to be in line with international conventions. We've committed to ourselves to respecting all the international agreements ratified by Egypt, because the Quran urges us to keep our promises and stick to our commitments. We have to respect contracts that we have undertaken.
And even in the case of a regime change in Egypt, if there was to be a change of government, the peace treaty with Israel has been kept in force. Is there any contradiction between Islam and democracy? Well, democracy is a modern instrument that we have at our disposal for managing power. We are trying to take an approach that would allow us to see if democracy permits society to reap the fruits of good government. But does democracy have uniquely positive aspects? We're opposed to simply having an alternance of power. Sort of throughout history, Muslims have frequently or repeatedly taken up the principles of democracy. In my capacity of Mufti, as a religious authority, a supreme religious authority, what I can say is this. Given the context in which I exercise these functions, I have to preserve the nature of that job. Before becoming a Mufti, the candidate has to have followed a certain course of studies, and they need to have specialized in the interpretation of religious texts based on religious criteria. Now that's the methodology that's been adopted by Al-Azhar, and that's a moderate interpretation of the religious texts. Do we have a little more time, says the Mufti? In any case, as for the mosque imams, we, of course, want to cooperate with them. I think everybody wants to be in full cooperation with the imams. We need to ensure that all of the channels of dialogue are open. Dialogue is necessary. And it's one of the fundamental ways in which we can facilitate dialogue between peoples. Well, I think I've answered most of the questions that have been put to me. I'd like to thank you very much for all of those questions. They were very interesting. And I think that they reflect your wisdom and your excellent knowledge of the situation in Egypt and the Arab world. Thank you very much.